Hello, everyone. Welcome. I'm Lisa Martin with Silver Spring Town Center, and we are so happy to have this special program as we celebrate Black History Month. We have Professor Stephen Brady, who is presenting his new book, Chained to History, Slavery in U.S. Foreign Relations to 1865. And it'll be a fascinating discussion. Before we get started, I'd like to give you a couple updates on other events we have coming up. We have almost something every night this week and next. Tomorrow night, we have a really wonderful artist and poet, puppeteer Schroeder Cherry, will be presenting sculpting, design, and character development in the creation of puppets and oral traditions inspired by the African diaspora. And that's here on Zoom at 7:30. Not to be missed. It's not really a puppet show, but it's more like a behind the scenes, what goes into creating puppetry with a focus on the African diaspora. And Schroeder is a really wonderful artist. We are having him back during Blues Week to present his barbershop series of mixed media. It's really fantastic. And then on Friday, we wrap up Black History Month with a poetry gathering in celebration of Black History Month with poet and SSTCI President Brenda Bunting, joined by other poets from our region. And that's always a really inspiring time to hear their poetry. That's at 7 on Friday night on Zoom. And then next week on Tuesday, March 1st, we have Smithsonian curator Jim Deutsch presenting Hearing Homelessness, DC's Unheard Voices. And that is on Tuesday night. And then on Wednesday, since it's Peace Corps week and I'm a returned Peace Corps volunteer, I'm actually hosting a special Peace Corps Museum Share and Tell with other returned Peace Corps volunteers who will be sharing artifacts from our countries of service all over the world. I served in Estonia myself. So you'll get to hear some stories and see items, artifacts, and we also have special guest Pat Wand from the Museum of the Peace Corps Experience. She lives right in Montgomery County, but it's a national organization. She's one of the founders of the Museum of the Peace Corps Experience, and she'll be telling you a bit about that. All of our events are made possible with generous support from Montgomery County, United Therapeutics, the Arts and Humanities of Montgomery County, Maryland State Arts, Montgomery College, and many others, including our Black History Month sponsors, Global Sustainable Partnerships, the Healthcare Initiative Foundation, and the Black Physicians Healthcare Network. They're working collaboratively to help raise awareness and in communities of color about vaccinations and other health issues. So they're doing great work that's much needed now. And so let me introduce our presenter. We have Professor Steve Brady, who's my old neighbor here from the GW neighborhood. I live near GW and he teaches there. Steve Brady is a diplomatic historian with special research interests in German-American relations, early United States foreign relations, and the Eisenhower administration. He also has teaching interests in military history, US peace movements, European diplomatic history, and the presidency. His first book, Eisenhower and Adenauer, Alliance Maintenance Under Pressure, examines the West German-American relationship in a crucial decade of the Cold War. His new book is Chained to History, Slavery and United States Foreign Relations to 1865. And it is, his current book project is Lesson Victory, American Catholics in the Vietnam War, Prior to joining the faculty at George Washington, he taught at the University of Notre Dame, where he was a first-year academic advisor for 17 years. Wow. And while at Notre Dame, he was honored with 3 teaching awards, including the Reverend Edmund P. Joyce CSC Award for Excellence in Undergraduate Teaching. He serves as the undergraduate advisor in the department now at GW, right, Steve?
Exactly.
Welcome, yep. Professor Brady.
Thanks so much. That saves me from having to introduce myself other than saying, hi, I'm Steve, and I'm originally from Chicago. And I'll leave it at that. Thank you so much, Lisa, and thank you to Silver Spring Town Center. And the only thing that I will say in way of autobiographical introduction, other than what I'm going to say soon about the book, is that I am down the hill from where I assume we would be doing this in the before time, right? I'm actually a resident of Silver Spring.
Great. Yeah, so you live right in downtown Silver Spring now.
Yeah, right across from the metro station. So you may hear trains going by out here. I always do, but yeah.
Well, as you know, since you're our old neighbor, you might hear the motorcade from the presidential motorcade going by.
Excellent.
So, but I will be on mute, but I'm here, and we will, I guess you'll present and then take questions afterward.
Yep.
Or along the way.
That sounds good.
Along the way or after. Okay, and we are recording for anyone who just joined us. Okay, take it away.
Sure. So thank you very much for coming out. And what I would, coming to your computers, and what I would like to say is that I did a radio interview about Chained to History last week, but it will not appear until mid-March. So this is the first time I'm talking to people about this book, which has just come out. They released it a little early, so it would be out for Black History Month. And this is very exciting for me. And so thanks again for coming out and hearing me talk about it. Now, what I understand that academics can be pretty boring when they talk about their own work. So let me just tell you what I'm going to do and hopefully why it might be a little more interesting. I plan on asking 5 questions, and I plan on asking 5 questions not of you, but of myself, and trying to find out what this book is about, why I wrote it, and why you should care. So let me load up a slide deck here, and hopefully this will go very well. And so far it's not, so let me try this again. All right, and then I'm going to ask you all if you can see this. Is that showing up?
Not yet.
Not yet. Okay, my apologies. Let me try this again. I apologize profusely. I always think I know what I'm doing, and then it turns out that I don't. I found it earlier, so let me try this again. Wouldn't this be fun if it didn't work out? No, I came up with some, oh, here we go. Hang on.
You click on the green share button and then you click on the PowerPoint.
There we go. I had to find it. Yeah. Okay, is that working?
Yes.
Yeah, there we go. My apologies, it had changed places and I couldn't find it. Okay, so here's the book. I will just say that I'm really happy with the beautiful cover that Cornell University Press came up with. So let me start with the first question, which is the threshold question. Why would anybody write a book on slavery in U.S. foreign relations, right? Why write the book? And I will say 2 reasons that I wrote the book, the 2 main reasons I wrote the book. One verges on the autobiographical and one on what we call the historiographical. In other words, what do historians write and what do we debate and argue about? So a little bit about the autobiographical. The origins of this book like the book that I'm writing now, go back to my teaching. I teach a class called U.S. Foreign Relations 1, the first half of a U.S. diplomatic history class. And while I was teaching that some years ago, it occurred to me slavery is one of the most important aspects of early U.S. history. Why don't I go out and find something to give the kids to read about that? And I looked in all the usual places and found nothing. I asked a friend and he said, well, there's one chapter in one book. That's all there is. That was from the late Don Fehrenbacher's The Slaveholding Republic, a fantastic book. One chapter, a very good chapter. I don't agree with everything in it, as it turns out. But I started assigning that to classes. But I said to myself, what we really have to do is get a book on slavery and U.S. foreign relations. One chapter is not enough. Someone needs to do this. And so several years later, when I'd finished the previous book, I decided that I would begin to work on something else. And so I began working on another book that got preempted by another scholar who used the same topic title and, in fact, the press I was going to submit it to. So I started working on another book. And guess what happened? That got preempted too. So I was left with one idea, and that was this idea of slavery in U.S. foreign relations. I was primarily trained as a Cold War and 20th century U.S. Diplomatic historian, but I said, this is a great topic. And I will just say, finally, autobiographically, this has been the most interesting project I have ever worked on in my entire career. A second reason, though, has nothing to do with me. It really is a factor of diplomatic history in general. It's a simple fact that, as I realized years ago, you cannot understand the roots of American relations with the world without knowing about the massive role played by slavery. And I firmly believe that this is not just the approach of my book, but it's a fact. The 1619 Project has helped increase awareness of the role played by race and slavery in American history. But if you look at it, and if you look at the scholarship that's coming out now, the focus has been on domestic affairs, domestic American history. So what went on in this country with slavery and race? The overwhelming focus has been on domestic development, not on international developments. So I still think while the 1619 Project has helped bring about a lot of questioning and a lot of scholarship is going on right now, I still think there's room for this book. Because as Professor Amy Greenberg, a prominent historian from Penn State University, has said, slavery shaped the United States abroad almost as thoroughly as it did at home. And this is the subject that Chain to History seeks to address. So another question that I thought would be interesting is this: when and how did this begin? When did slavery start impacting American foreign relations? And it may come as no surprise to you that I'm going to say from the beginning of the nation. Now, starting in 1775, during the War of the American Revolution, the British had this policy. And the policy was that if American slaves were able to escape to their lines and bear arms, and you can see some of them on the left there. The guy on the right, I have no idea what he's doing, but anyway, you can see on the left black soldiers. If they were able to escape to the lines and bear arms, they were free. They were free forever. And that started out in 1775. And then in June of 1779, the British commander-in-chief, this fellow, General Guy Carleton, proclaimed all slaves free if they escaped to the lines. If they got to the British lines, they were free, whether they would bear arms or not. So now women, the elderly, children, the infirm, if they were able to run away and get to British lines, they were free. And several of George Washington's escaped this way, along with 5%, about 5% of all slaves in Southern colonies This is a substantial amount. This is 1 in 20 enslaved people. And needless to say, Southern slaveholders wanted them returned after the American victory. This brought me to something that I really enjoy, a little piece of art. This is a Benjamin West painting. In 1783, the peace commissioners met to negotiate what becomes the Treaty of Paris to end the War of the American Revolution. And you can see behind Ben Franklin there, I'm sure you all recognize Ben Franklin, a fellow who looks like he just rushed into the picture and has shown up late. You'll see on the right, a couple people, one sitting, one standing, should have been painted there and weren't. Supposedly Richard Oswald, the chief British negotiator, and his aide wouldn't sit for the painting because who wants to be memorialized for a war you lost and shouldn't have. But the fellow in the middle there, who's also not finished, is Henry Laurens, a South Carolina slaveholder who showed up late because he was just out of British prison. Now, his contribution to the Treaty of Paris, because he showed up late, was very limited. It was actually one clause of one article. So one clause of one article, Article 7 of the Treaty of Paris. One clause is all he contributed, but it was a doozy. He said this: the British should withdraw forces from the United States, 1783 Treaty of Paris. The British should withdraw forces from the United States, quote, without causing any destruction or carrying away any Negroes or other property of the American inhabitants. Without causing any destruction or carrying away any Negroes or other property of the American inhabitants. This is what Laurens contributed. Sounds clear? Sounds obvious? Sounds like we should know what it means. It wasn't, and we don't. No one did. What did this mean? Did this mean that the British had to return all the slaves that had escaped to their lines, the ones that they had already liberated? Or did it only mean that they had to leave without taking any more property or slaves than they already had liberated? So in other words, did they take the slaves that they already had liberated and make them free somewhere else? Or did they have to return the ones that they had already taken? Now, Americans assumed that it meant all slaves currently in British hands must be returned. So their view is a rather stringent one, that the British couldn't leave without returning freed blacks. The British, however, interpreted this as meaning that they could leave with the ones they already had. These were no longer slaves, these were free people, and they could go with the British. Well, how do you resolve this? The very different interpretations. George Washington, who has lost slaves himself, wants them back. In 1783, George Washington met with General Carleton at Orangetown, and he expressed surprise and concern. This is George Washington, expressed surprise and concern that the British planned on pulling out of the United States and taking the freed slaves with them. He said, this is a violation of the Treaty of Paris. You said that you wouldn't remove any blacks from this country. Now, Carleton responded, and this is great. I got to go into the archives at the Library of Congress and actually handle copies of these documents and actually see a document with George Washington's signature on it. It was a lot of fun. But Carleton essentially says to Washington, nope. Now, he said it in a more sophisticated way. But look, the clause, he said, of the Treaty of Paris means no additional slaves may be carried off, as the phrase went. No additional slaves. So what Lawrence's clause meant, according to Carleton, was, look, we will take the slaves who have already escaped to us. What the clause means is we can't take any more. And Carleton's interpretation becomes the official British response. Every time the Americans make demands, you've got to return the slaves. that you took, they say, nope, that's not what the treaty says. The treaty says we keep the ones who are already with us and we take them somewhere else. So the result of this was diplomatic back and forth, which I won't get into in detail. I do it to some degree in the book, which caused trouble in already difficult relations between the US and Britain. And the back and forth, as on other issues, went nowhere. The British simply refused to return a single person to slavery. Now, the Secretary of Foreign Affairs for the new republic, keep in mind, this is under the Articles of Confederation. We don't have a constitutional a government under the US Constitution yet. So Secretary of Foreign Affairs was this fellow John Jay, a major founder who sometimes gets forgotten. And Jay, who was then Secretary of Foreign Affairs, as I said, thinks he comes up with a way to deal with this problem, square the circle here. In 1786, he says, look, the British don't have to return the slaves, right? Returning the slaves would be, he says, in fact, that returning the slaves would be something immoral. And he can understand the British position, but they've got to compensate the slave owners. They've got to pay money to the slaveholders who lost slaves carried away by the British. So now the Americans are going to make a new demand, compensation. You don't have to return them, but you got to give us compensation. And to make a long story short, the British simply refused this too. They said, no, we're not paying for them. This is in the Treaty of Paris. And so I will say in the book, I conclude this section of the story by saying, look, fittingly perhaps, the price that these slaveholders paid for their own freedom was the freedom of the slaves that they had held. Story over? Not at all. It wasn't over yet. Unresolved issues, a number of unresolved issues still simmered between the US and Great Britain. Some of you may know about this. And those unresolved issues resulted in another war with Britain, the War of 1812. The issues that hadn't been dealt with culminate in the outbreak of another war, sometimes called the Second American Revolution, because it establishes, yes, the United States will be free of British domination. And what we get from the War of 1812 until the mid to late 1820s is what one scholar called an eerie replay of the debates that followed the revolution, the things I just went through. Because guess what? During the War of 1812, the British said slaves with the ability to could choose to escape to British lines should do so. There's one taking up the red coat. And this posed for years what seemed like an insoluble problem for Anglo-American relations, because once again, the enslaved who could escape to British lines did. And once again, the British took them in and said, you're free. So once again, at the end of the war, peace negotiators met, this time in Ghent. And once again, they failed to clarify whether the slaves had to be returned or not. The language taken in the Treaty of Ghent was surprisingly similar to that much debated wording of Article 7 in the Treaty of Paris. Article 1 of the Treaty of Ghent essentially does the same thing, right? Slaves and so forth and property shall be restored without delay and without causing the destruction or carrying away of, et cetera, any slaves or other private property. And that comma right there before the or turns into something very important, but we'll get to that. So the result again was more than a decade of failed diplomacy, which led to hostility between the United States and Britain. And I won't go into all the details. I do in the book. So if you have any questions about it, I encourage you buy the book. But suffice it to say that the American diplomats, led by the greatest, from my perspective, the greatest diplomat the United States has ever had, John Quincy Adams, American diplomats made multiple attempts to get the slaves back. And domestic politics are very important here. the government in Washington was responsive to slaveholders, and that's one of the key things to keep in mind. They wanted the slaves brought back, and the administrations of Monroe and then Adams made serious efforts to placate them. So slave owners are, and we'll see this develop, really starting to influence the federal government in the direction of the interests of the slaveholders and slavery. In fact, one US commissioner who was supposed to be negotiating this stuff went to Bermuda, where many of the slaves had been taken by the British. And he spoke with the British admiral there, who was in charge in Bermuda, a fellow by the name of Sir George Cockburn, Admiral Sir George Cockburn. He said, you've got to return these slaves. And Cockburn said, I love this quote, I would rather that Bermuda were sunk under the sea than surrender even one slave, which seems a bit of a drastic step, but the British were serious about this. They were not going to return the slaves. Attempts at higher level negotiations also failed to gain any restitution. The British Foreign Secretary, the redoubtable Lord Castlereagh, who ends his life tragically committing suicide not too long after this. But Lord Castlereagh, a terrific diplomat, was insistent that, as he put it, a human being is not like furniture. You can't ask for it back when the war is over. You can ask for furniture back. You can't ask for a human being back. And the British were, as you can tell from both Cockburn and Castlereagh, saying these are human beings. You can't treat them like you would treat real property. So finally, Madison and Monroe and Adams suggested, okay, let's try this again. Why don't you compensate? Why don't you pay the people for this? These people who were carried away. And the British agree. And they say, okay, let's talk about this. And both sides agree that what they're going to do, and I find this fascinating, is this. Let's take this issue. Do the British owe Americans compensation, or do they not? That's the issue. That's the only issue. And we're going to take it to a neutral party. And a neutral party is going to make the decision. And that neutral party, they both agree, will be the Tsar of Russia. They're going to go all the way to St. Petersburg, Russia, to find somebody to make this decision. So let me pause here, not just to take a drink of water, but to emphasize how bizarre this situation becomes, how odd slavery and foreign policy can be. So you've got two English-speaking nations, Britain and the United States, and they're arguing essentially about the grammar of one particular clause, and I get into the details of that in the book. What did this clause mean? And it comes down to grammar. So they turn to a guy who doesn't know any English, the Russian emperor, the Tsar, and they ask him to look at a French version of this English language document. So a Russian is looking at a French version of an English language document and coming to a conclusion about what the grammar means. The grammar that two English-speaking nations hadn't been able to parse. Well, finally in July of 1822, keep in mind this thing's been going on since 1814, Tsar Alexander came to a conclusion, a very ambiguous conclusion, but the upshot was that US slaveholders were entitled to compensation. So Tsar Alexander says, yes, the British have carried away slaves they shouldn't have carried away. The Americans get compensation. So finally a victory for American diplomacy in this whole matter of slaves in US foreign relations. Sort of. It took 4 more years to negotiate how much the British actually owed the Americans, and it came out to, they finally agreed on $1.2 million, which is about $34 million if my calculations are right in today's money. And so historians debate this. Who had won? Who had won this? Was this a victory for the Americans or not? I don't think that's a very interesting question, to be honest. I think the thing that and I don't think it's answerable. What I would look at is this: the Senate ratified this agreement unanimously. So clearly at the time, a lot of American leaders thought that this was in the US best interest. But what I want to say about this is a little broader than all this. Why have I gone through this issue in depth? One, I lead off the book with it, but two, it comes out to a lot more than that $1.2 million, because it indicates what is truly important. This whole lengthy episode indicates what's truly important here. The US government, since the time of the revolution, had pushed to get slaves returned. In doing so, as I see it, they had done three important things. One, on the world stage, the Americans had asserted the right to hold human beings as property. And again, diplomatically, on the world stage, Americans had said that human beings can be held as property, right? So asserting in diplomacy that this was a reality. Secondly, they'd asserted the great significance of bonded labor for the new nation, for its politics, for its foreign policy. So first they say on the world stage, we have a right to hold human beings as slaves. Secondly, these are really important for us. We cannot have them taken back without compensation. And finally, and vitally important, the US foreign policy would seek to secure the interest of slaveholders on the world stage. The US foreign policy was going to be devoted to helping slaveholders in American foreign relations. And the importance of this cannot be overstated. The episode that I've just gone through demonstrates that from the beginning, the US was going to use its, what historian Matthew Karp says, outward state. So diplomacy and the military tools to defend slavery in the United States, and indeed in the Western Hemisphere. So that brings us to the next question. I hope that clarifies what I'm talking about in this book fairly well. That brings us to the next question, which I think is very interesting. The US, as we just saw, was willing to defend slavery through its foreign policy. So the question is, what happened when the United States made this decision? And I can't get into everything. That's the rest of the book. But I want to look at one particular development here, because the United States was so devoted to protecting slavery that it nearly brings war. I put up here this Vast Southern Empire, the only other book on slavery in the United States. It's more limited in chronological scope, and Matthew Karp of Princeton is really interested in the slave holders who helped make American foreign policy and direct American foreign policy during this period. But I like showing copies of books of colleagues and other scholars. So if you buy only one book about US foreign policy and slavery, buy mine, and this one, buy two. American policymakers were so committed to the foreign policy of slavery that even war seemed acceptable to maintain slavery in the hemisphere. And the issue boils over in Cuba, and about Cuba. Cuba, a colony of Spain and a slave society, a colony of Spain and a slave society. And one of the clearest cases of a pro-slavery foreign policy, a policy directed towards maintaining and even expanding slavery. Now, initially, Washington policymakers were content to have Cuba stay in Spanish hands, right? We don't need to take it, let the Spaniards keep it, right? So long as they keep slavery, as long as they hold on to Cuba and keep slavery as an institution, no threat to us. All is well. But when it started looking like slavery was endangered in Cuba, and there's a picture of slavery in Cuba. When it started looking like slavery was endangered in Cuba, Spanish control of the island began looking like a threat to the US, and a panic set in. and this led to repeated unsuccessful attempts to acquire Cuba for the United States. So I'm going to say something about that. And this in turn threatened to bring war with Britain or France or Spain, or even all three of them at the same time. That's how important slavery was to US foreign relations. Washington proved willing to even go to the brink of that kind of conflict. So let's say just a bit about this. Now, the renowned historian Robert May has said it is remarkable that Cuba never became United States property. Exactly so. Americans thought for decades that Cuba would just kind of fall out of the sky into American hands, that eventually it would become a state, or Southerners wanted to become 3 states so they could have 6 senators. So a little bit of background. The US had wanted since the beginning to preserve slavery in Cuba, and it's understandable. It's only 90 miles from Florida, and Florida had become part of the United States in 1819 and will enter as a slave state. So there's this idea that slavery would be endangered in Florida and the rest of the South if slavery ended in Cuba. And there had been plots. There had been early plots, 1810, 1821, to try and overthrow the Spanish rule in Cuba and bring Cuba into the United States, but these plots went nowhere. And overall, the basis of US policy was this. Let me just show you this. One, so this is the overall basis of US policy on Cuba for quite some time. One, Cuba remains in Spain's possession. Spain keeps Cuba, not Britain, not France. Secondly, Cuba must not be transferred to any other country, right? Cuba has to remain in Spanish hands. Cuba must not be transferred to any other country. And finally, the US, you're right, it won't be transferred to any other country except maybe us. Point C, the US would not renounce an interest in taking Cuba in the future. The US refuses to engage in what they call future self-denial. So again, Cuba remains Spanish hands. Spain promises not to transfer it to any other country, except point C, perhaps the United States at some point in the future. But the key for some time was point B here, non-transfer of Cuba to any other power. US interests were protected as long as Spain was in control of Cuba. But there's a problem, a dilemma. Spain is clearly a waning power. Its glory days long in the past. And for some time, Spain's very weakness was an advantage to the United States. You look at the position of Cuba in the green there, as you all know, in the Caribbean, and a weak nation like Spain is not going to bottle American commerce up in the Caribbean. A powerful nation taking control of Spain, and the big fear here was Britain, with its great navy, could keep American commerce bottled up in the Gulf. And that would mean that the entire Mississippi River, the lifeline of the American economy, would be cut off from world trade. Spain's not going to do that. Not a threat to commerce in Mississippi, not like it would have been if Britain held Cuba. So as long as Spain holds Cuba and keeps it a slave society, I have to emphasize that again, as long as Spain holds Cuba and keeps the institution of slavery, all is well. The problem is it's a very delicate balance. For this policy approach to work, Spain has to be weak, right? So it's not a threat to American commerce, but yet not too weak, because it still had to be strong enough to suppress slave rebellion in Cuba. The big fear here was that there'd be a slave rebellion that would take over the island. You look at Cuba's neighbor to the east, that's Haiti. In 1791, and you cannot overstate the significance of this. In 1791, slaves had risen up in Haiti and taken over the country. And the fear was always of another Haiti and the Cuban Haiti. Spain had to be weak and yet strong enough to prevent slave uprising from taking over in Cuba. So it was a delicate balance, and yet a vital one, because the abolition, the end of slavery, was seen as a huge threat to slavery in the US, as I said. Thus, emancipation of slaves in Cuba had to be prevented by whatever means necessary, whatever means necessary to prevent slavery from ending in Cuba. And so one of the means that American policymakers hit upon was this. In the 1840s, the administration of John Tyler, a much forgotten president, Tyler and company began to take the danger of abolition in Cuba very seriously, especially against the background of several attempted slave revolts in Cuba. Maybe in the 1840s, Americans begin thinking maybe Spain is no longer up to keeping Cuba a slave society. Maybe if Spain continues to control Cuba, they won't be able to keep down slave uprisings. In this context, the contours of American foreign policy began to change. Perhaps American annexation of Cuba was now ripe. Perhaps American annexation would be a better option than keeping Cuba in the hands of Spain after all. So Tyler offers Spain money to buy it. Polk offers Spain a lot of money to buy it, President James K. Polk. Polk offers $100 million, which would be $3.5 billion today. It's a lot of money back then. And Spain absolutely refused to sell Cuba. In fact, this policy of slavery, this foreign policy of slavery causes a rift between the United States and Madrid. The government in Spain and Madrid finds it insulting that the US would even ask to purchase their territory and their most vitally important part of their waning empire in the Western Hemisphere. Things don't get better. They get more tense, much more tense, with the election of Franklin Pierce in 1852. So Franklin Pierce is elected in 1852, takes over in March of 1853. And his desire to take Cuba was blatant. The Pierce administration made a full-on attempt to take Cuba for the United States, and slavery was the key to the whole thing. Slavery was the key motivation to the whole thing. By this point, as the scholar Robert May, whom I just mentioned, said, Southerners had become possessed by a dream of Caribbean empire, and slavery would be intrinsic to this realization. Now, slaveholders and their northern allies like Pierce are starting to think we could develop an empire for slavery in the Caribbean. We could develop an empire of slavery. Long story short, the US drive to take Cuba was now determined by Southerners' interests in slavery and that of their northern allies like Pierce. Big problem though, and here's where the conflict is going to begin. Britain and France are totally opposed to the US taking Cuba for a number of reasons, but in fact, the French emperor at the time, Napoleon III, had pledged to fight on Spain's side if the US tried to take Cuba. So the United States trying to take Cuba is playing a very risky game. Spain won't give it up. And if the US tries to wrest it from Spain, France says we will fight the United States. And if France goes to war against the United States, there's a good chance that Britain will join in on Spain's side as well. So pushing a crisis with Madrid could lead to a war, not with one or two, but three European powers. Well, if Pierce had been looking to provoke a crisis with Spain, let's just say he couldn't have done better than he did to provoke that crisis. He chose his foreign policy team well if what he wanted to do was risk war over slavery. Secretary of State William Marcy was a New Yorker, but one who wanted to take Cuba away from Spain. That's not going to go over well with the Spaniards. The U.S. minister to London was James Buchanan, a Pennsylvanian who had a long history of wanting to annex Cuba to the United States and of being sympathetic, though a Pennsylvanian, to the interests of Southern slaveholders. Buchanan, who will go on to be reputed to be one of the worst presidents in American history, was very willing to work in the interests of slaveholders. In Paris, James Y. Mason was America's minister there, a Virginia slaveholder, ardent advocate of taking Spain away from Cuba. And D, the most bizarre choice of all, went to, in fact, Madrid itself. This was the U.S. minister to Madrid, Pierre Soulé, Louisianan and a slaveholder, who was about the worst choice possible for that diplomatic post. You get in a lot of trouble when you do things like shoot at other diplomats while you're in a foreign country and challenge them to duels. And this was Pierre Soulé in a nutshell. But the overall point is this dominance of a pro-slavery elite making U.S. foreign policy. Very impressive at this point. And these were men who could not, as one scholar has put it, envision a global future without the fundamental institution of African slavery. If slavery were threatened, these guys would act to protect it. So the question was, could the Pierce administration use the power of the federal government to remove this threat through the acquisition of Cuba for the United States? Could they use the outward state, the power, the diplomacy, and the military of the United States to wrest Cuba away from Spain? Because Cuba was not going to fall into American hands. It would either have to be taken, bought, or wouldn't come into US hands at all. So they tried and they failed, and they tried and they failed. And the diplomacy was ham-handed, no question. But the fact of the matter was, the central reason for the failure of the Pierce team to gain Cuba was this: Spain said, no, absolutely not. And Britain and France supported Spain. And no amount of unity or resolve on the part of the Pierce team of slavery advocates could make them bend under these circumstances. Spain knew it had the support of Britain and France and refused to give in. If the US wanted Cuba, it would have to come get it. Washington would have to take it. And in the end, the Pierce administration, having risked war with 3 European powers, backs off and says, we don't have the power to fight that kind of war. They risked war, they backed down, and the United States, as we all know, never took Cuba. But the key to this all is the power of pro-slavery Southerners and their Northern allies in making policy that could take the United States even to the brink of a disastrous war. That's how powerful they were. Another question then, how and when did it end? Well, for the first time in 1861, the US had a president who didn't intend to protect slavery, but rather to see its eventual eradication. And this was a huge change. Abraham Lincoln and his Secretary of State, William Henry Seward, had to tread carefully. The problem was this: the key element to the Lincoln-Seward foreign policy was this: keep Britain and France from intervening on the side of the Confederacy. Keep Britain and France from intervening in the Civil War, because if they do, it's lost to the United States and the Confederacy will break away. So what's one way of preventing, in this foreign policy of slavery, what's one thing that the folks who don't like slavery can do? They can say, we are fighting this war to eradicate slavery, and then Britain and France would have no chance of intervening on the side of the Confederacy. They're not going to intervene in a war to save slavery. Would have worked, but Lincoln and Seward couldn't do it, because domestic policy was key, domestic politics. If Lincoln declared that this war was about the ending of slavery, the border states would have been lost. The border states which had slavery but were loyal to the US would be lost. And Lincoln was convinced that the loss of the border states, and especially Kentucky, was the whole ball game. The loss of the border states would result in the loss of the war. So Lincoln and Seward downplayed the role of slavery in their diplomacy, with the result that the chances of British and French intervention went up. And if Britain and France intervened again, there goes the war. So Lincoln and Seward faced this key dilemma. In a war brought on by slavery, they had to pretend on the international stage that slavery was irrelevant. They told their diplomats, because they don't want to push the anti-slavery angle, the abolition angle, and lose the border states. And so they told their diplomats abroad in London, in Paris, in Madrid, don't talk about slavery. Don't mention slavery. Don't mention slavery. And the US minister in Madrid, this fantastically interesting guy, if you don't know about him, he's fascinating. Karl Schurz, a German immigrant who makes it to the Senate, who makes it to the Secretary of the Interior and general during the war, said this. I love this quote: failure to stress our anti-slavery policies, quote, stripped our cause of its peculiar moral force. Stripped our cause of its peculiar moral force. The power that we really had over the British and the French in this was that we could say, we are fighting to get rid of slavery and the South is fighting to maintain it. But as you all know, neither Britain or France did intervene. There were multiple reasons. The biggest one was that Britain and France didn't want to go to war with the United States. The United States was arming significantly at this time, both Army and Navy. But another reason was this. In September of 1862, Lincoln issued the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation, making it absolutely clear that this war was, as they say, about slavery. And the Emancipation Proclamation goes into effect January 1st, 1863. And when the United States and the Lincoln administration finally say, this is what this war is about, we will fight from this point on to end slavery in the South, British intervention becomes unthinkable. British abolitionist sentiment was so strong, no British government could ever have intervened on the side of the South. And if Britain won't intervene, France is not going to go it alone. And so in this sense, the key point is this: Lincoln and Seward were successful in the only foreign policy priority that really mattered, avoiding European intervention. And what I want to emphasize is this: slavery was not the only reason for US success in this diplomacy, but it was one of them. And it was something that kept the Southern diplomats at a disadvantage. And that's important too. So very briefly then, what is the upshot of this book? What am I arguing? Why read this? Well, one, I make the point that slavery impelled and enticed the US to engage in the wider Atlantic world. In other words, the United States has this reputation, and still does, for being isolationist early on. It wasn't, but it could have been a lot more so had it not been for slavery constantly pulling the United States out to intervene abroad, including with sub-Saharan Africa, which the United States otherwise would have had nothing to do. But even Liberia becomes an important factor to the United States. So slavery is pulling the United States and pushing the United States out of any sort of isolation. Secondly, the point I really want to make is this, because this has been misunderstood in the past. Just because slaveholders made American foreign policy doesn't mean they got what they wanted. This international context conditioned and restricted what the US could accomplish. And that's a key element with this Cuba issue. The US absolutely in the 40s and 50s wanted to take Cuba, but the other powers prevented them from doing so. So try as they might, slaveholders could control US foreign policy, but they couldn't dictate to the world. Another point that I think is really significant. Slavery was one of the most important determinants of American foreign policy, and it just hasn't been studied enough by scholars. My overall point, because I see that I'm out of time here, is this. In order to understand the diplomatic history of the United States, one must understand the impact and the legacy of race and slavery in US relations with the world. And that brings me to the end of my presentation. Thank you so much for letting me yell and scream about my interest here. Are there any questions? And will those be audio or will they be on chat?
Yeah, we'd like to have questions verbally if possible. Do you want to stop your screen share and then we can pull people up on the screen too if they'd like to?
Absolutely, yes, thank you. I'm sorry, I'm so excited about
Yeah, that was great. It was so interesting.
I'm so excited about this topic that I forget that I've got the screen up there. Okay, we're good.
Okay, so please raise your hand if you have any questions. We can take them in the chat as well if you want. We have a lot of people sending great, great presentation. What a wonderful, fascinating presentation.
It's a great topic. Yeah, please.
Yeah, I'd like to know more about why you consider John Quincy Adams our greatest American president, or greatest American diplomat.
Diplomat, yeah, he was not the greatest American president. And I will say this, my best friend in our field is my former doctoral director, and he says I'm crazy about this when I say John Quincy Adams, because it's Dean Acheson from the Cold War period. But I think he was our most successful diplomat and Secretary of State for a number of reasons. One, the Monroe Doctrine is named after Monroe because he's the one who articulated it. It was written by John Quincy Adams. Adams made a serious attempt to reach out to Latin American nations right after they'd become independent and develop a connection with them that the United States didn't have to have. Even during his presidency, which was not terribly successful and he didn't get reelected, he's got a strategy. He's the first American policymaker who actually thinks of things strategically. What are the connections between our interests, the threats to those interests, and the resources we have to protect those interests? So through his ambassadorships, through his Secretaryship of State especially, and through his presidency, he's the one who thinks more strategically than anybody is going to think for almost 100 years afterwards. The other thing I'd point out about him is, because I appreciate someone bringing up John Quincy Adams, is this: he is known, if for anything now, as his post-presidential period in the House, where he is radically anti-slavery. He is known for getting up and giving speeches and being shut down and giving more speeches until he dies on this floor of the House. You can actually see the spot where he died if you go on a tour there. And I would say that the interesting thing to me is this guy was so anti-slavery, and yet he himself was willing to push for the return of slaves or the compensation for slaves. That's how significant slavery was in American foreign policy, that even this guy who hated slavery was willing to push for it on the international stage. So you asked about John Quincy Adams, I'm going to talk. My apologies.
Okay, Robert is asking, in doing your research, was there anything that you did not expect to find or that particularly surprised you?
Yeah, thanks, Robert. A couple things. So one smaller thing, but what a number of things surprised me. One of the things was that James Buchanan, who was, let's be honest, a lousy president and pro-slavery, was the president who started really trying to suppress the slave trade up until, and that stunned me, up until Buchanan's presidency. The US Navy had been stopping seizing one or two or zero slave ships a year. He comes in, he cracks down, he sends steamships to the Africa Squadron to stop slavers, and he's getting 12 or more a year, up from 0, 1, or 2. So that was interesting. But the thing that really struck me was this. I'll try to make this brief. I tend to go on about this one too. But I looked at some Russian newspapers from the period and a Russian magazine, and from the Civil War period, I should say. And the Russian liberal intellectuals who were writing, and these are the only newspapers that are still available from that on microfilm, were dead set not only against slavery, but against the British and the French for even thinking of supporting the South. And one of my favorite quote in the book, and I don't have it memorized, I'm sorry to say, but my favorite quote in the book is a Russian journalist who's looking at African Americans who served in the military, the U.S. military during the war, and we know a lot about that from Glory and so forth. It's become famous. One of my doctoral students is writing on that right now, African American soldiers. And the Russians look at the African American soldiers and they say, these are people who have earned their freedom and deserve it. I mean, it's really hard to imagine many Americans saying at that point, that these were people who earned their freedom and deserved it. And yet that's a Russian living in the most oppressive government, under the most oppressive government at that time. So I was just, I was floored by how the Russians were so friendly towards American slaves and so hostile to the critics of the Lincoln administration. Yeah, that really surprised me. Thanks.
So, it's hard to scroll through all the comments in the chat.
Oh gosh.
Margot says, what a wonderful, fascinating presentation. Pam, thank you so much for this book and this presentation. Barbara says, wonderful. Thank you, Steve, for this informative presentation. And now a question from Robert. Oh no, he was the one who asked the last question. The next question is from Dio. Was Buchanan's attempt to suppress the slave trade based on the fact that the U.S. had developed its own domestic slave breeding industry? The international trade would be in competition with a domestically focused industry.
Yeah, okay, so that's absolutely correct. And it's a big part of it. There are two elements to it. One is that there's a domestic, what you say is absolutely true. There's a domestic slave trade that's going from north and east to south and west into what they call the Black Belt of cotton growing. What you've gotten is tobacco exhausting land. And so people begin planting in the northern tier of the South and the border states more wheat. And wheat is not as labor intensive, and it's seasonal. So you just don't need slave labor anymore. And so a lot of people who were trying to sell their slaves to the South and to the West didn't want the competition. That's absolutely correct. They wanted to keep the price high. And that meant that you couldn't keep bringing slaves in. A second issue, though, is a foreign policy issue. The British were, by that point, so hostile to the slave trade, and I really hammer away at this in the book. that they are pushing and pushing and pushing the United States to crack down on the slave trade. And there's actually this fear that the British will that the British will start seizing American ships, American flagged ships, if we don't do something about it. And that was the big issue, that slavers were hauling up the American flag whenever a British ship would show up, and then they couldn't be boarded. And so the Buchanan administration isn't willing to let the British seize American ships, but they're worried, American flag ships, they're worried they might, with the result that the British are going to be less likely to do so if the Americans are doing something about suppressing the trade. But the domestic issue is absolutely a factor. Thanks for that question. Yeah.
Okay, and also, if anyone has if you would like to jump in and ask a question, you can just raise your hand or unmute yourself and I'll bring you on. So I was just looking up, I was struck by the quote you shared that you really loved about in regards to the morality of it. You know, I mean, how can you explain, just in a nutshell, and you touched on it in various ways, how could we, the US, be so behind the times? I mean, even Russia had outlawed slavery long before. Many countries had outlawed it a century or more before. Is it purely just the greed of exploiting others, or was there something else that was lacking in we didn't have the moral authority that we think we have, I guess, or we couldn't get everybody on board.
Yeah, I mean, there's certainly an economic element to it. There's no question about that. But the United States had developed, I think this is just plain and simple, had developed a very racially stratified idea of the world. And this the historian Michael Hunt has talked about America's racial hierarchy being created on the anvil of slavery. And I think Americans, more than a lot of other places, and slavery will last longer in Brazil and Cuba than in the United States, okay. But having said that, why it lasts so long in the United States has a lot to do with the fact that Americans had this hierarchy of race, which said that there were certain people that could be enslaved. The British move away from that. The French move away from that. The United States, it takes this bloody war to overcome that. And I'll say, to extrapolate from your question a bit, because I do that in the book, that the end of slavery doesn't mean the end of racial hierarchy in American foreign policy. Mm-hmm. The racism easily crosses the barrier into the 20th century. I have an example, for instance, that in 1919, at the end of the First World War, Woodrow Wilson, who was a devout racist, has a chance to, the Japanese propose that in addition to religious liberty being guaranteed by the Treaty of Paris and the League of Nations, racial equality is, and he shuts it down. They vote in favor with only 3 nations against: Britain, Poland, and the United States. Weird combination. So the delegates all vote in favor, and he just tables it. He says, no, we're not going to introduce racial equality into international law. And so this hierarchy of race continues, and that's not my term. Again, that's Michael Hunt's term, and I think he's absolutely right. Continues and permeates the boundary of the 20th century. And so slavery goes away. The impact of slavery on American perceptions of race and foreign policy, that doesn't go away. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that does. And how would you describe the impression that the rest of the world had of the United States on the diplomatic stage? I mean, did the diplomats just view the U.S. as behind and ignorant and brutish and vulgar? And I mean, was this part of the formation of the notion of the ugly American?
Oh, that's an interesting question, because we generally think of the ugly American as being, hang on, I apologize. Train going by. Okay, did you hear that?
Mm,
Yeah, okay, that's the Acela, I think. We generally think of that as a Cold War term, and that's the phrase that gets used during the Cold War with the Letter of Burdick novel. But I think there is an element here where there's a real perception on the part of Europeans especially during the American Civil War, that there's something fundamentally wrong with American diplomacy if it's going to support the war, during the war, if it's going to support slavery. And I think the classic example, a really good example of that is during the Civil War, where Southern diplomats, the South is represented in London and Paris and Madrid and so forth. Southern diplomats tend to be shunned more than anything else. They have a lot of trouble gaining access to the right circles. And part of that is this sense that, the Lincoln and Seward didn't stress anti-slavery in their foreign policy early on. I made that point. Nevertheless, the British and the French understood what this was about. And I don't just mean the elite, the working classes understood what this was about. And they're not really willing to allow Southern diplomats into their society. And so Southern diplomats were always at this disadvantage. And I think that's part of it, that there's just this sense that there was something fundamentally wrong about what they were doing. And this is why American diplomats, US diplomats, wanted to be unleashed. Charles Francis Adams and guys like that. Yeah.
right. And so once the administration at the time realized that their Southern diplomats were being shunned, did they start selecting only Northern diplomats primarily?
Actually, that's a really interesting question, because the US government is going to, during the Civil War, appoint some Southerners and border state people. And my classic example is the guy who he'll twice represent the United States, 2 different terms, in St. Petersburg in Russia. And he's a guy by the name, I love this story. He's a guy by the name of Cassius Marcellus Clay, who went to Yale. He was a Kentucky slaveholder, went to Yale, turned against slavery, freed his slaves and gave them his land, and then moved north. So he was a former slaveholder. They sent him out there, and he is pushing and pushing and pushing and saying, you've got to declare that this is a war about slavery. You've got to declare that this is a war about slavery. And so there were former slaveholders who were diplomats. He's the classic example. One of the reasons I love talking about him, other than that he's a really fascinating guy, is this. His freed slaves obviously appreciated what he did. That name, Cassius Clay, would continue to be used for their sons, including a guy by the name of Cassius Clay, who changes his name to Muhammad Ali. So that's where the name Cassius Clay comes from. I saw a question here, because I realize we're running low on time. Can I say more about Liberia? Sure. That plays a big role in 2 of my chapters. So what can I ask the person who asked the question? I didn't see who that was. What would you like to know?
Sure. Yes, we're just have to find, because there were other comments after. Mary.
Yes, it's me.
Yeah.
You mentioned that Liberia came into the picture in terms of the Lincoln administration and the people that were freed having to leave, go somewhere, I guess. So
A bit here was the idea. Yep. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, there was a big program on NPR the other night about Liberia. I forgot the name of the guy who's originally Caribbean, I think, who spearheaded, when they were attempting to bring freed people back. I can't remember the name.
just wondering how they negotiated or came up with Liberia, period. I mean, what happened
Oh,
that they
sure,
ended up
yeah.
with that portion of, West Africa? I'm just curious.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. I will say this very, very briefly and get on to Liberia. The two stories that I found most interesting that I worked on are one, Haiti, where slaves liberate themselves. And I became fascinated with Tucson. I can become kind of obsessed with it. And Liberia, where former slaves and liberated and Africans liberated from slave ships went and founded this new society. And it becomes really interesting to me because it's still an element of American foreign policy. The people who led the American Colonization Society, who thought of themselves as really great people, and their view was, let's free the slaves and then get them out of here, right? Okay. They pressed the U.S. government to help found a colony for freed slaves. And the U.S. government would, I get into this in the book back and forth about how much help to give them. But one of the things that ends up happening is that Liberia, well, it's not Liberia at that point, Cape Meserado and so forth, they make several attempts. Everybody keeps dying because of disease there. And finally, it takes root, declares its independence, and the United States, under the worst Secretary of State, if I can say that in history, Abel P. Upshur, who was a devout racist, a devout pro-slavery diplomat, nevertheless says, don't mess with Liberia, they're under our protection. I found that fascinating because the British in Sierra Leone didn't like the idea of an American settlement bordering their colony there. But one of the things that's really significant with Liberia and Haiti, and that's one of the reasons I put them together, is these are Black-led nations. And the United States will not recognize them because two things. One, they don't want Black diplomats in Washington, which would happen if you exchange ambassadors. But two, they want to maintain this myth that Blacks can't govern themselves. And to recognize them would be to say, for instance, Liberia, they're actually doing it. They're capable of self-government, and we're denying them that. In 1862, Lincoln is going to say, this will really tick off a lot of people. I'm going to recognize both. And we end up with, this is the story that I want to tell. I want to write an article on this. I'm not sure it'd be a book. What was life like in Washington for the first Black diplomats, the Liberians and the Haitians in Washington in 1862 through the rest of the Civil War? I don't know the answer to that. I think it would be a fascinating story to see what was it like being a Black diplomat in Washington at that time. So I'm going off on other projects now, but anyway, yeah.
Yes, go ahead. Who is asking?
It's Terry. I just put in the chat, there was another PBS show earlier, a few days ago, on American diplomats, first-class patriots abroad, second-class citizens at home. It's later than the period you're talking about, but it goes through the issues. It was really actually very good.
Okay, yeah, I'll have to check that out.
Yeah,
that's in the chat.
Yeah, I put it in there, the 15th of February, right? But it's Lincoln. It's in PBS. I don't think it was Passport. I think it was regular.
American Experience. Okay. Oh, yeah. Okay, thanks. I think that's based on a book that, or there's a connection with a book that a scholar at Baylor is writing right now. Ronald Angelo Johnson has been working on that. So I hope he's the top-notch scholar. Yeah.
Yeah, I was just wondering, I haven't checked it out, but I remember they referred to Todman as one of the first diplomat. Do you know anything about him?
Well, no, I haven't gone that far with my.
I thought he was Jamaica.
He
was from Jamaica, not Haiti.
And the very first African-American diplomat was Ebenezer Bassett. And a few years ago, we hosted the author of the book, A Diplomat of Consequence, about Ebenezer Bassett. And that was, the author was Christopher Teal, who's a diplomat himself, but learned more about him, I think, while he was serving down in the Caribbean. I think Bassett was mostly sent to Haiti and some of the Caribbean countries. So do you know much about the African American diplomats prior to Civil War? Were they also sent to other across the Atlantic?
Prior to the Civil War, and for a time afterwards, there really weren't African American diplomats. I mean, one of the things that really struck me, so to answer Robert's question again, was that Toussaint, when he's negotiating with the United States in a country run by Blacks who have liberated themselves, right, will only send white diplomats to Washington.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I found that absolutely fascinating, that he conducts really good relations with the Adams administration, very, very productive relations, but his intermediaries are all white. He knows how Washington works. Very clever guy, but he knows you send a Black diplomat to the United States and they won't be given the time of day.
Right. I mean, I imagine even in the North, where slavery and inhumane treatment would not have been tolerated, they still had their biases. And
oh gosh, yeah,
for sure.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the people who led the colonization societies were Northerners. There were plenty of Southerners, but there were Northerners as well who their idea was, you're absolutely right. If these people get liberated, a lot of them will go to the North and we don't want them, so let's send them somewhere else. So they try Africa, and Liberia will eventually end up working after they find someplace a little healthier than where everybody's dying. They try an island south of Cuba. They're going to try Suriname. They're going to try Latin America, and the Latin Americans said, no, we don't want them. So that never got off the ground. So Northerners, and Lincoln was one of them, said, yeah, we want these people free and we don't want them free here. Yep.
Okay. And do you know how many former slaves were literally, willingly went back to Africa or were shipped back? Were they mostly unwilling to go, or was it a matter of choice or not?
Well, it's a great question. The answer, I don't know the number. The answer, as far as that goes, was the American Colonization Society held to the position very firmly that they would only send people voluntarily. So they had a voluntary right. So nobody would be forced to go to Liberia. You had to volunteer for it and want to go. So, but the overall things you're talking, when they start talking about founding a colony for ex-slaves, you're talking about 900,000 people at that point. You're not going to get 900,000 people. You're not going to get a big fraction of that to say we're willing to leave and go someplace that, and how would you get them there? I mean, it's just amazing. And so, I mean, the idea of voluntary, as they called it, voluntary repatriation,
Right.
was never going to work. But I don't see how it would have worked anyway. 900,000 people, how are you going to send them anywhere, right?
Mm-hmm. Right. Well, in this program that was on NPR the other night, talking about the efforts to bring more people, repatriate more people back to Africa, they said that there was, even though not everyone volunteered to go, a lot of the African Americans donated to the cause, even if they weren't interested in
Going themselves.
Yeah. So there was a lot of financial support, but and I'm trying to remember what it was called. It was, I mean, it's a famous effort, but the guy who spearheaded this was maybe after 1900 though. This was
Okay, yeah.
or around that time. So
Okay. Yeah,
yeah,
I'd love to watch that because that's really fascinating to me. I can't think any.
I have to look it up.
of it. Yeah.
It's
If you could
yeah.
email that to me, that'd be great.
Yeah, I'll dig it out. I listen to so many things.
Okay. Yeah.
And great. So do we have any more questions for Steve? Professor Brady?
Steve. Yeah.
Steve, I know we know each other as neighbors, as I mentioned at the start. Okay, well, and can you, I guess we're nearing the end of our time then. So can you tell us about your current project with Vietnam and Catholics?
Sure. So the question is, can I tell you about it briefly? And I'll make an attempt to do so. So I teach a class on the history of U.S. peace movements. And we've got three key elements in that. I call them the three legs of the stool: religion, women, and African Americans in the peace movement. And I do religion starting with the Quakers in the colonies and following it through. And a student asked me, God bless him, said, "You talk a lot about Protestants. Is there anything on Catholics in the peace movement?" And I said, well, there's some stuff. And then I went and I said, I'll find some stuff for you. And I realized there's really nothing other than on the Berrigan brothers and a couple other things on Catholics in the peace movement. And I said, there's a book in this. And the idea that religion and foreign relations are actually connected and significant is big right now. And so I'm writing, so I'll say this, I'm writing a book, I'm about halfway through it. And it is turning out to be absolutely fascinating. And what I'm finding is Catholics are debating earlier than most the morality of the Vietnam War. So not just, is it a good idea? Is it winnable? But is it wrong?
Right. Well, great. Well, that'll be interesting. We'll look forward to inviting you to give a talk on that when you're done with that book. No rest for these authors and historians, right?
It's constant. It's constant. Yep.
Constant studying and oh, and Pam Stuckey asks, what about the Unitarians?
Involved in the World Council of Churches and the National Council of Churches, and thus actively, not all of them, but actively, Unitarians were actively, especially ministers, were actively involved in the anti-Vietnam War movement through the National Council of Churches, especially. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Right, and then of course churches played
yeah. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Of course, churches played an important role in the abolition movement as well.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Right.
In Britain and the United States, yeah.
In Britain as well, yeah. Oh, we've got, yeah, I think we have another question. Okay, so, okay, now that was just a private message to me. Anyway, this has been really a fascinating discussion, Steve. We really appreciate it. It was so interesting, and I started reading your book. I'm gonna have you sign it when I see you next.
Glad to.
Yeah. So I think Mary, do you have another question or comment?
I was just applauding.
I think
the hand looks like a hand raise, or right. Yes, it was great. Thank you so much, and we'll look forward to inviting you back for more discussions. And be sure to get Steve's book, Unchained: History, Slavery, and U.S. Foreign Relations to 1865. It's on Amazon, and also
I would say this: if you actually want a copy, and I would encourage you to buy them. They make great gifts for all occasions. Buy it this month because it's Black History Month through Cornell University Press, and it's 44% off. So as much as I'd like to see my sales on Amazon go through the roof, 44% off is a good deal. Cornell University Press. You can
And
get
is it, yeah, if you just Google the title of the book, Chained History, Slavery and U.S. Foreign Relations to 1865, it'll come up first with Cornell
Oh, sure.
site. But do they need a code to get that discount? Because I didn't notice the discount when I went on.
It's supposed, it's been on there, but if not, let me know. Are you looking at it right now? 'Cause
Okay.
I bought 10 copies for other people, and the code was right on there. Yeah.
Oh, so maybe once you, once you go through the purchase process, then the discount will come up.
Yeah.
That sounds good. Okay, well, great. Well, thank you so much again. And
Thank you. This was so much fun. Thank you
Yeah.
for letting me give a trial conversation about this book. I feel better about it now. Thank you so much.
is this your first Zoom talk on it, on the
yeah.
book?
Oh, yes, I've got
Great.
an interview coming up on the 11th with New Book Network. I was interviewed by a radio program, but that's not going to be on till next month. So this is my first appearing interview.
Oh, great. Well, you did a great job, but you're a pro being a professor.
Yeah.
So yeah, well, great. And I'm sure your students enjoy, all those history students at GW, I'm sure enjoy your classes. And are you guys back in person at
You're in
GW?
person, but we're masked. Yeah.
Oh, that's hard, but
It's
I think
hard
it
to
ends
breathe and
Monday.
yell at the same time. Yeah. But
Isn't it ending Monday? The mandate?
we don't know about what they're going to do on campus. Yeah.
Right, right. And there's many more praises for you in the comments. Pam says, feel very privileged to have been able to attend this presentation. And there are more layered up in the chat. I just want to invite everybody to join us tomorrow for our, in the next 2 nights, we have 2 more events for Black History Month. The other one is with puppeteer Schroeder Cherry, who will talk about sculpting and creating puppets and the character development inspired by the African diaspora. That's at 7:30 tomorrow. And then we have a poetry gathering in celebration of Black History Month, not to be missed, hosted by SSTCI President Brenda Bunting. And thank you so much again to Steve Brady, Professor of History at GW. Get his book, Unchained History, Chained History. Chained History and U.S. Slavery and U.S. Foreign Relations to 1865.
Yep.